I need to go into now is where we generally start the slide presentation. And this is where we start talking about our belief patterns of what we think is true and is not true. You see, we were all raised with a certain, most of us were raised with a certain belief pattern about how things were and how things are. And we have certain limitations that are placed on ourselves by our parents because of what we believe is true and what is not true. As this unfolds more and more, you'll see how important your belief patterns are. And there are many, well, sorry, another way, the history of our planet as we know it, what we get in our history books in our schools, very well may not be true. It may not even be close to the truth. Not even close. Because realize that whatever the books were written by the people that won the wars. It was always wars that shaped our history. And so whoever won that war said, well, this is what happened. And a lot of times it was just a single person, like a king or something, deciding this is what happened. And which may not be even true. What would happen if Hitler would have won World War II? How would the history books read? Totally different. Totally. You know, we would have been the bad guys, and you know, and it would be necessary that you are absolutely important. All these various things totally would have changed. But we don't think about that when we read these things. We just assume this is the way it is. And on many, many, many levels, we've been given this, not just in history, but in all kinds of levels, we've been given this same kind of thing. Our parents tell us, you know, you can do this, but you can't do this. You can jump 6 feet high, but you can't jump 30 feet high. You can, you know, the hospitals, the doctors tell us you can cure this disease, but you can't cure that one. And we keep putting these walls and these limitations of what's true and what's possible and everything else, until someone comes along and breaks those rules. But in history, there's been, the rules have been broken many, many, many times. But our history people just keep shoving these things under the mat. They don't want us to see it. They don't want us to know about a lot of these things. And it's only until really recently, in the last 20 years or so, that a lot of these things have been allowed to be talked about. Before that, you just couldn't even talk about them. They wouldn't let you. And so I'm starting with this first one, which is from Robert Temple. He wrote a book called The Sirius Mystery, and the Star Series. And he chose this particular subject matter after looking at, I think, 11 or 12 other subjects that were just about as good. I'm glad he chose this one for certain reasons that we can see. And what Robert was writing about is that there was this tribe in Africa called the Dogon tribe that holds certain information that by our present-day standards of understanding, they could not have this information. It's impossible for them to have the information. Yet it's written in these caves. And it's been written in these caves for 700 years. It's all written down in these caves. And there's this one man, this one Dogon man who sits there, and he's untouchable. Nobody can ever touch him. He sits there and guards the cave. That's his whole job, his whole life. And when he's done, and they give it to this one other guy who sits there their whole life and guards his cave. And it has all these symbols and everything in it. And according to the Dogons, they talk about that there is another star, a dark star, that rotates around Sirius. Now, Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. It's a 4.6 magnitude. And if you were to look at the belt of Orion, which is 3 stars, you could go to your left about so far in the sky, and you come over to this really, really bright star, which is Sirius. If you move the other way, you'll come up to the Pleiades. And According to the Dogons, there's another star that rotates around that star. And they're very, very specific about this other star. They say that it's this very heavy matter, extremely heavy matter that the star is made out of, and that it's an old, ancient star, and that it's real little. And that it revolves around this star. Now this is where a contradiction that I have to check out on my own. Everything I've ever read has said that it was 50 years. And however, a television special just came up recently and said it was 60 years. And I about fell over because I've read everything I've ever read, so it's only said 50 years. I'm not sure now. I've got to check this out, but it was either 50 or 60 years. That the star rotated around in either 50 or 60 years. Well, we have checked here on Earth and have never been able to see this star. And didn't know if it, so we just assumed it was fantasy. Until, I believe in the 1950s, they got a telescope finally. I had thought also that it had been done from space when we first put one in space, but they said in this TV thing it had been done from the ground. But they finally got to the place where they were able to see this star one way or another out there, and they saw the star, and they were able to locate, and they did locate this other little star moving around it. And when they did, they were amazed because the star was a white dwarf. Stars are like people. They live and they grow. We'll talk about this again at the right time. They have very definite growth patterns. They move to very definite levels of awareness and changes that are in them are very specific. And our star, the baby star, it starts out at hydrogen, and then all the light and life that's on this planet comes from the fusion reaction of two hydrogen atoms that form helium. But then eventually when the helium process builds up great enough inside there, when the concentration of helium builds up, then another fusion reaction begins, which is three helium atoms coming together forming carbon, which just took place on our sun in 1972, which is the beginning of why some of the situation here on Earth. And that process keeps going on. So, and when a star gets old and it gets toward the end of this fusion process, and it moves into a certain area of space, it has a choice. It can either blow up and become a supernova, or it can expand out and become a red giant, at which point it will contract back in and become a white dwarf. And and so the first thing they did is on this white, this happened to be a white dwarf, which is, like they said, it was a little ancient small star. It's a very compressed tiny star. And when they calculated its orbit, it was exactly whatever they said. It was either 50 or 60 years. It was, instead of 50 years, it was 50.1. It was so close. It was almost exactly the same. And that just couldn't be a coincidence. It's just too much. And they described in great detail how heavy this was. Well, I remember the first data that I got 20 years ago or so when I was studying this was that the 1 cubic inch of a white dwarf that was brought on Earth would be 2,000 pounds. And I remember saying that at one point, and people go, wow, 2,000 pounds. Well, the new data that comes up now is 1 cubic inch is 1.6 million tons. If you can imagine 1.6 million tons in 1 inch, if you put it down on the ground and just keep going to the center of the earth, it wouldn't be much to stop it. And so when they said it was heavy, they weren't kidding. It was really a heavy star. And so the fact that they were able to do this was amazing. And then they held other data that is also impossible. They had great detail of the planets, what they looked like, what was on them, what the colors were as they approached them, all kinds of data that is all written down in the caves, which we didn't even know until just the last few years. As we, somewhere, I can't remember Voyager or whatever it was that was going out there, as it went past some of these planets, began to realize that this data was true. So at one point, not too long ago, we sent a scientific team to these guys to ask them, how do you know this? how do you know this information? Which in a way was kind of a big mistake, because if you realize that their information is correct, then you've got to accept how they got the information, right? But that was as soon as they found that piece of information out, that's when they shut them with the rug. Because what the Dogon said was, well, this flying saucer came out of the sky, came down and landed on 3 legs, and they got the picture of this in the cave also, and that the beings in the ship made a big hole in the ground, they filled it with water, and they jumped out, and they looked like dolphins, and they came up to the edge of the water and talked to them, and told them about the planet that this is where they came from. This is what they said. And the scientists just said, nah. And just shoved it under the rug. But and this was the picture that they gave to them. They called them the Nomo, N-O-M-O, and that they were half in and out of water, and they breathed air, and they had the fin facing this way, which is the only. There's no fish that have this. Only the animals, the cetacean nation, has. I forgot what's that called when it's fit? It's got a name. When it's facing this way. And so these were cetaceans. These were air-breathing animals that came out and lived there. And they were dolphin-like, anyway, put it that way. You cannot say for certain that they were dolphins. And they said that when the Nomo came here, that a new star appeared in the heavens, and that it hung in the sky over them, and that the Nomo said that they came from the star, which was really the mothership that came down from, and that as soon as the Nomo left, when they left and did this, the star disappeared. So this is a very interesting little bit of information. There was another bit of information that was extraordinary that was given to the scientists and was studied by a group of Australian astronomers. They said that this was the image, that this image was given to them a long time ago. Now, realize the Dogons lived near Timbuktu in northern Africa in the desert, and they're talking about dolphins, right? And this information has now been traced way back into ancient Egypt and further back into Sumeria, which we'll talk about later. This may be more ancient than what Robert Temple has up in there. But anyway, this particular pattern was given to them, which they said was the view of A and B from Earth. It's now called Sirius A and Sirius B. And Sirius A, it isn't A or B, which is the little dark star, moves around Sirius A like this. It's a more complex pattern. There's a third place in space, and Sirius B moves like this, and Sirius A moves like this around it, and the two make a double helical pattern as they move through space in this complex pattern, which, according to the computers in Australia, is identical to the DNA molecule. And they found that, again, an amazing little thing. But what was real interesting is that this pattern, which is at least 700 years old, happened to be a specific time thing. In other words, when it's put in the computers, that ever-changing pattern from Earth, that this specific pattern was exactly from the year 1912 to 1990. And those are real important dates, those particular dates, especially 1912. When we talk about the Philadelphia experiment and stuff later on, that was a very important moment in our history in 1912. And so why the Dolphins wanted to know exactly about this particular time, I don't know for sure, except that it is very pertinent to us. And this happened to be the time when were even aware of the pattern. We wouldn't even have known what the pattern was before, but they were giving us one earlier than that. So, just realizing this is one little bit of information showing that maybe there's something else going on in our history other than what the history books have told us. In 1985, I was giving took a tour of people, a small group of people, through Peru. And we went along, one of the things we were going to do was to go along the Inca Trail, the original Inca Trail, which is about 40 miles through the jungle, 14,000 foot peaks and stuff, drops down into Machu Picchu. And the night before we were going to take, you have to take this little train out in the middle of nowhere and then leap out the windows of this train because they'll stop for 30 seconds to take off again and get out of this thing and where you begin the trip. The night before this took place, we were in a place called Cusco, which is it's a city in the shape of a puma, a cat, and we were in this very fancy hotel, a 4-star hotel. I don't remember, well, the name of it will come up here in a minute. And I was, with one of the people I was traveling with was one of these people that had been on one of the expeditions over to Dogon tribe. And he was telling me a lot of stuff about this. And he was telling me how the number 23 was so important to the Dogons, because the star Sirius dips below, from the northern hemisphere, it dips below the southern hemisphere, at least from Egypt, put it that place, on the 23rd of July, and stays down, or excuse me, it dips below a couple months earlier than that, but it rises up above the horizon on the 23rd of July, and it's called the helical rising of Sirius. At that particular moment, early in the moment, right before the sun comes up, in fact 60 seconds before the sun comes up approximately, the star Sirius rises above the horizon and it comes up a ruby red star. And then 60 seconds later, the sun comes up directly behind that, which blocks it out. And so at that moment that the sun rises, you have, in deep space, you have the star Sirius, our sun, and the Earth in a straight line. And that was the first day of the Solstice calendar, which was the Egyptian calendar, and many other the ancient Egyptian other ancient calendars were based on the helical rising of Sirius. Why they chose that, we don't know. But as this unfolds about Sirius here in a few minutes, you'll become pretty good idea why they chose that particular moment. Anyway, I'm sitting in Peru, feeling like I'm in Peru right now. It's getting colder in this room. Is it possible to come up at least a couple degrees or so? And we get room 23, of course. And we go into room 20, and he's telling, hey, we got room 23, good sign, all this. And we go into room 23, and on the bed was this symbol in Peru. And I remember standing there for about 5 minutes looking at this, and we were trying to figure out the link in our, we didn't say anything, we just looked at this bed for about 5 minutes, trying to figure out how that symbol had got from the Dogons in Africa over to Peru. And because it was the same one, and or very, very, very close to it. In fact, this is it was the Hotel San Agustin International, Cusco, Peru. And I went around to all the people and I said, people work there, what does this mean to you? Well, it has something to do with our creation, but they didn't know. They were almost all Spanish that ran this thing. They didn't really know the creation stories of the Indians that were behind us. It wasn't until I got to Lake Titicaca, and it was it wasn't the Quechuan, it was the ones that float out on the islands out there. Euros, what they are? I can't remember. Anyway, there's an island tribe that they live on reeds, They build their islands daily by putting reefs, and they float on these islands. They got these whole cities out there, with buildings and cars and everything else. No cars. Buildings. No cars. But there's buildings out, metal buildings and everything else floating out on these reefs out there with houses and homes and chickens and goats and everything else like that. And they did it a long time ago to escape being killed, and they just stayed there. It's real weird when you're walking on these things because you look off and there's water right there, and they're saying, now walk where we walk, and we're walking exactly where they walk, and if you walk in the wrong place, and you just... They lost somebody a week before. They kept saying, now we lost somebody a week before, so stay real close. I was walking exactly where he was. Anyway, they told us that, oh yeah, they knew what this was, and they said that was the creation symbol. And pretty soon after a while, we started talking to other Indians, and they all had the same story, pretty close. Same thing, this flying saucer came out of the sky, landed in Lake Titicaca, and these dolphin-like creatures came out, jumped out into the water, came up to the shoreline, and talked to them, and began their culture. Now, when you read Zecharia Sitchin, which I'm going to talk about his work a little later, he talks about how the first piece of land that broke the surface of the water was the island of the Sun, which is in Bolivia, which is in the middle of Lake Titicaca. And there's a rock there, which is supposedly the point that broke the surface. And that was where Thoth came to and landed there and began the Incan culture anyway. And which is exactly what Thoth told me. Exactly. Before I'd ever even heard of Zecharia Sitchin, he said he went to the island of the Sun, and that's where he had stepped out and began the whole thing. It was it's really amazing. I didn't know about Zecharia until about the last 2 years or so, and because most of the history that I got from this man named Thoth, who I'll talk about in a little bit, and I couldn't. It was just absolutely amazing to me as I was reading this, that how the Sumerian records, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, and what Thoth had told me from another dimensional level, just fit together just like two perfect keys. So I can't find any mistakes at all. Can't find even anything. It seems perfect. But, which are the actual written records of our history, which we're just becoming aware of right now. We're just now becoming aware of what was written down in Samaria. But give me just a few more minutes, I'll get to that. So anyway, here's a very similar story about dolphins somehow having to do with the creation of this area. If you want to read an article, which I have here, this also came out of Australia. It's called Our Father Who Art in Water, and which is a lot of the dolphin data that has been gathered from around the world. If you read this article, which I guess we can copy or something, I don't have it, it's a pretty thick one here, it'll really amaze you, because all over the world a similar story is told, how dolphins have had an amazing influence in the creation of a lot of the ancient cultures, especially around the Mediterranean, from Greece to lots and lots and lots of places there, not just Greece, there's a lot of other places that they've had a deep influence. And their influence on Australia has been very, very powerful. The original ships that landed in Australia, the lead ship was called the Sirius. And it's now called Sirius Bay, where they landed. And the Sirius Star is on the Australian flag. And there's more dolphins around the continent of Australia than anywhere else in the world. No one knows how many, of course. There's a lot of dolphins in the world. I don't know if you know how many dolphins. Most people think there's a few dolphins out there in the ocean and they're endangered and we've got to be careful. That's far from the truth. There are certain species of dolphins that are endangered, like the pink dolphins of the Amazon River, and there's a few other ones that are endangered. But by and large, we've got, 5.5 billion people in the world? That's nothing compared to the dolphins. There's 7 dolphins minimum for every person. There's at least 35 billion dolphins in the waters. That's a conservative estimate, and there may be as many as 50 billion dolphins in the waters. It's incredible. And they're a race of beings from another place, as we unfold here. And they're on a level of consciousness so far beyond where we're at now that we can't hardly talk about it. Anyway, I will talk about it. But they probably had a big influence on us at one point. I'm going to change the subject a little bit here and go to, this is out of the Clarion Call magazine, Mathematics and the Spiritual Dimensions by David Osborne. I don't know if David was the one who first came up with this or not, but he was the one that reported it. The Sanskrit language has been around a long time. It's one of the oldest languages in the world, so we're talking about going about maybe close to 6,000 years old. And for a long time, well, there were a lot of these little poems that were in Sanskrit language, and eventually at one point they translated the language, and when they interpreted the poems, they believed that that was it, that they had finished their job, that once they had interpreted the poems, that was all there was to the poems, until recently. And I guess this has been maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing 4 or 5 years ago. They discovered that the Sanskrit had numerical value to the various sounds. Again, remember ka was spirit, and ka happens to be either 0 or 1. But you have all these different sounds that are possible in there, and there is a numerical value associated with each one of these sounds. And in this particular poem, and they're unfolding this now in all of them, I guess, they took the various sounds and put the numerical value to them. Now, I don't know how they figured out the numerical value. Don't ask me that. You'll have to go back and research their things. But when they did that on here, they found something that was rather amazing. They found pi for 32 digits of accuracy. Now, these are supposedly hairy barbarians back there, who were just emerging out of the nothingness from our present-day thinking. How could they possibly create accuracy of 32 digits? This is it right here. Only there's no decimal point, so it's really pi over 10. So they don't know where the decimal point is. But to that kind of perfection, could not be a coincidence. Impossible. The coincidence, if that was a coincidence, that would even be more ridiculous. And yet, there's proof that they had the ability to do that, right back from the very, very beginning. Well, there's way back there in the beginning, there was all kinds of things that archaeologists and people who study these things really don't understand, at least most of them, don't really know how it's even possible. The Sumerian culture, just in approximately 3800 BC, just appeared out of nowhere with a full language and a full spectrum of knowledge, some of which that we're just regaining right now. For one thing, they knew the precession of the equinoxes. They knew that, which is the precession of the equinoxes is that there's a, if this was the axis of the Earth, there's a wobble in that axis. And if you were to look at that tip, it forms an elliptical pattern, and it takes a little less than 26,000 years for that thing to go around. It's about 20, depends on who you talk to, 25,900 roughly years, 950, some people say. Some people say 850. But a little less than 26,000 years to go around one time. They knew it exactly. It's been calculated by astronomers that it would take 2,160 years minimum to even know that you were in a wobble. So, if the culture started in 3800 BC, and they knew that in 3800 BC, and there was nothing before that, no writing, no nothing, then how did they know that we were in a precession of the equinoxes when it takes 2,160 years of continual, constant, every day and night observation to be able to come up with that? They had written the Sumerians had written on their walls the entire solar system, the whole solar system, all the way out to Neptune, Plato, all of them, all the way out there, in their very exact sizes and everything, and shapes, on the wall. They had written in crude form on these round clay tablets, which they now have over 100,000 of these clay tablets out, and they're madly trying to get them all interpreted and written out and what they mean. And what's unfolding is a whole new history beyond our. It's almost Star Trek. What's coming out of that? It's amazing what's coming out of this. It's hard to accept, but I'm going to go into it anyway. Because it is history, it's archaeology. This is what our ancient people are telling us, the oldest people that we know. This is what they are saying is happening, which is totally different than what we've been told. And they had the planets described in detail, in absolute detail of what it looks like to approach them from space. And I mean, so much so that when we were passing past the further one, Neptune, etc., and going past those, Zecharia Sitchin, from reading the records, was able to tell NASA what they were going to find before they got there. And he was 100% accurate, telling them the exact colors and nature of the planets before they ever even arrived there. And he purposely, publicly did it, because he was just reading the records. And he did it beforehand so that they couldn't say, well, you knew, because we did it before we knew, before we got there, and he was absolutely accurate. And all he did was just read out the records. So how could they have known all these things? Somebody's not telling us the truth here. Something is, something just isn't right. And there's a lot more. There's a really big one going on right now. This is a really, really big thing happening right now. And it has to do with the Sphinx in Egypt. There's a man named John Anthony West. I really support his work. I highly recommend you listen carefully to everything he has to say right now, because he's changing the face of history. And he's already done it. It's just now a matter of throwing out the books and starting over again. We don't have any choice anymore. He happened to notice, he wasn't the first person to notice this, by the way. The first person was Swallow de Lubitz, a long time ago. Noticed that the Sphinx had incredible wear patterns on it. These wear patterns were as much as 12 feet deep. And it was Swallow de Lubitz who noticed, by looking at them, that this sits in the desert here. And what's the Gobi Desert? Is that what it is? Sahara Desert. And the Sahara Desert is at least 7,000 years old. That's been determined in geology. And the wear patterns, however, that are on there appear to be made by water, not by sand and wind, which is the only erosion factors that are in a desert. But they appear to be made by water, and it was Swallow de Lubitz who stated this a long time ago, 30, 40 years ago, whatever it was. And there's been other archaeologists who have come up, like John Anthony West, who could also see this and say, because they're putting this thing at what did they date this at? 2600 BC, I think. They put it in the 4th dynasty, Cheops. roughly, somewhere around back in there. And there were many buildings that were made at the same time by Cheops. And when you go to those buildings which were supposedly made at the exact same moment these were made, you look at them and they look like they're brand new. There's hardly any wear on them at all. You come to this and it's like, wow, this is incredible. And so nobody would listen to this. Nobody would for many years, nobody would listen to Swallow Lubis, no one would listen to John Anthony West, and other people, I'm sure, who have looked at this and thought the same thing. This is very, very old. And finally, John got this geologist, Robert Schoch, I think is his name, out of the United States, to take the time to go over there and look at it. And he did, and then by many trips of going over there and by doing a pure, straight, scientific analysis of the wear patterns and using computers and all the other various things that we have now, regardless of what anybody else has to say, forget about the archaeologists, what they have to say about it, from a pure geological point of view, that thing has water patterns on it, wear patterns on it from water, and it's been calculated to take 1,000 years of constant torrential rain to create that depth of wear. Which means that this is a lot older. It had to go back before the desert. That puts it back 7,000 years old. And another 1,000 years minimum, that's if it rained constantly day and night and never stopped with total buckets pouring on it. And putting it back 8,000 years old. So they're saying, well, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years old. And that's been established over there, and by doing a pure, straight, scientific analysis of the wear patterns and using computers and all the other various things that we have now, regardless of what anybody else has to say, forget about the archaeologists, what they have to say about it, from a pure geological point of view, that thing has water patterns on it, wear patterns on it from water, and it's been calculated it would take 1,000 years of constant torrential rain to create that depth of wear. Which means that this is a lot older. It had to go back before the desert. That puts it back 7,000 years old. And another 1,000 years minimum, that's if it rained constantly day and night and never stopped with total buckets pouring on it. And putting it back 8,000 years old. So they're saying, well, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years old. And that's been established. And they have tried, scientific community has, they've been huge, I've got all the paperwork here, you can look at it. That happened, I think, in 1990, 1991, they had scientific community came together and investigated all of his work and looked at it. Other people have gone over there. At this point, they just shrugged their shoulders and said, it's true, it's got to be true. This has got to be at least 10,000 years old. Well, according to everything that we know, the Sumerian culture began in 3800 BC. Before that, nothing. No writing, no culture, no nothing. Just hairy barbarians wandering around and something in the trees. And hitting each other over the head with clubs, and all of a sudden, bingo, here's this amazing culture that appears out of nowhere. And so if there was nothing before 3800 BC, which is what all your history books are going to tell you, then, and that's 10,000 years old minimum, who did it? Obviously, this is a great dilemma for historians. And the books have to be rewritten. And now they're going to have to take Plato a little serious. It's even been talked about in the United Nations. They're going to have to take him a little serious because he referred to this place called Atlantis, where there was another culture long before him. And no one ever took it seriously. Now they've got to take that seriously. They've got to start investigating to find out who was there, because this is the largest sculpture in the world, and it required somebody a little bit more. primitive people doing, wandering around. For those of you who are Edgar Casey fans, and from the ARE and this kind of thing, is anybody here from that? A few people. Edgar Casey talked about the halls of records, and how that someday these records would be opened, and that they would prove that there had been cultures, vast cultures on the earth, way beyond our imagination right now. No, not beyond our imagination. They're still third dimensional, we can imagine it, but beyond our belief almost. And that have lived on Earth going back 5.5 million years. And according to Thoth, who is the person we'll talk about, we actually have cultures on this planet going back 500 million years. Way, 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 way beyond where we're at now. This is nothing compared to where we've been before. But with no traces, or almost no traces left, which will explain why there's no traces right now. And then according to Casey, this would be the key that would open up the halls. You see, and the halls are where these physical records are that can be carbon dated and even further in other ways to date back to prove that these things are ancient. And also, you can still use them, and they can do things that we can hardly believe, which will prove that they were vast sciences way back in there. And this would be the opening. And the opening, they said, would be in the right paw of the Sphinx. And for a long time, they thought that was sort of an arbitrary place, just the right paw of the Sphinx or what. But it's not arbitrary. You'll see. It's all of this has there's logic and meaning behind all of this. And well, the records are not held just on physical objects. The records are held on many dimensional levels surrounding this. So I find it very appropriate that even though books like what Robert wrote, and a lot of other things, and there's lots of other things, you could keep going on in this for a long time, there's a lot of other stuff that has come up that has challenged the belief systems of the history, that this happens to be the object that actually cracked the egg. It was this one that did it. Not any of these other things. That. And it was in 1990 when that began, which that Thoth said. I'm not sure if Edgar Casey said it or not. Thoth said that 1990 would be the year that the halls would begin to open. And again, 1990 was the year that the Dogon put the final point on. The information that you're about to, most of the information, especially having to do with history and these kinds of things, a lot of the stuff comes from this man. Now, the things that I'm about to tell you are fantastic by normal ways of thinking. Again, you'll have to see for yourself if what I'm saying is true or not. But this is hieroglyphics here. It's written on papyrus paper, which is supposedly the first paper. He was the person, according to Egypt, that introduced writing to the world. Egypt supposedly started approximately 500 years later. It's not true. It started simultaneously with Sumeria, and that'll eventually be proven here real soon. But right now, and I'll explain why there's this 500-year difference at the right moment. But both Sumeria and Egypt started at the same time, but they were started from two different sources. One was called Mommy, and the other was called Daddy. That which created us as a race before came back to start unfolding who we are. But this whole thing is hieroglyphics. It's a form of writing. Hieroglyphics means holy writing. And it's all hieroglyphics, not just this up here, but this too. This is a symbol which means a very specific person. And in Egypt, his name was Thoth, spelled Thoth. And And he doesn't look like that. He doesn't have a bird head on his body. That's the hieroglyphic that represents him. He looks very much like, he would look Egyptian if you see him today. And he's holding two reeds in his hand, which are the papyrus reeds. And he's holding an ankh in his hand, which is one of these, which is a symbol that represents eternal life. In any of the hieroglyphics, when a man is holding that or a woman is holding that, it means they've reached immortality. They're no longer ever going to die. And by the way, immortality has a definition from our point of view. It does not mean someone who lives in the same body forever and ever and ever and ever. That's called a trap or something. Not going to do that. Immortality means that your memory pattern and your consciousness has no more break in it anymore. You have total memory going back to the moment, at least to the moment that you began in mortality, and your memory and your consciousness has no break, no matter where you pass through. There's no loss. Like right now, we die and we go into particular overtime in the fourth dimension. We forget that we're here once we're there, and then when we come back this way, we forget that we came from there and back over here. Keep making the cycle, forgetting each time, though it's accessible because it's in our. It's magnetically held, so it's possible to reach into these ancient memories, old memories, but we keep forgetting. But once you reach immortality, there's no more forgetting. So you can leave and you can die at will when you want to. You can leave a body. You can go into other, because as you will go on, you will find that there's other bodies that are more appropriate for higher levels of consciousness than this one. And at some certain points, you'll realize that you don't need any body at all. But the consciousness continues on. But this person here, he considers himself an earth person. In truth, we're all from somewhere else other than earth, because earth, we're all from somewhere, not necessarily from earth. But he considers himself that because that's where he gained his immortality, was here. And he gained it during the time of Atlantis, approximately 52,000 years ago. He has remained in the same body for 52,000 years and has walked on Earth for 52,000 years, walking around. And he could have left here and gone on with one of the past cycles if he really wanted to. But he chose to stay here, very much, for you Hindus out there, very much like a bodhisattva now, where he realized that we were all connected, and he decided to stay back, even though he could go on and be a teacher and to help the lower aspect come up. And he just left, though. At least part of it did, anyway. And he made this transition over this octave, along with 31 other beings who made the first time ever of this consciousness level upwards to the higher levels. And so anyway, a lot of this is going to be coming from this one particular person. A great deal, about 50% of that is coming from there. And when I got here, one of the first things I did was connect with him. And then at the right time, when I needed to know the histories of the earth, he gave me the histories. He had such a long memory. And his mom is 200,000 years old. She's still walking around also on the earth. And so he has a long memory pattern going back pretty much to the beginning. Though he says that something happened 5.5 million years ago that was really big and could never explain to me exactly what it was, or I couldn't understand what it was. And something big time hit the earth, because we can't get through to the ancient memories before that. And I don't understand, from my little point of view where I am right now, I don't understand how that's possible. Because once you create an action or something happens, it goes into what's called the Akashic Records. Mathematically, if you strike a bell, that bell will never go away. It's called asymptotically reaching a limit. Mathematically, it will theoretically exist forever. and it should still be attainable if you could track down to the golden mean spiral to the place where it started. But something happened, must have been really big, and they can't get through, and so none of the ancients can get through this. They can't consciously go back, though there are records that go back. They still can't consciously go back like they can the first 5.5 million years, according to him. Anyway, this is his symbol, which is an ibis bird. I think several reasons why they chose that, but one of them is because it hangs out in the reeds all the time. The second time I was in Egypt, I went all over looking for one of these ibis birds. Looking through all the reeds. I must have went through about 5 miles, went through reeds. And never could find one of these guys, and never did see one anywhere, not even from a distance. I had to go back to the Albuquerque Zoo. And that's an ibis bird right there. They look like little sort of pink, short storks. And here's Thoth writing. This is an actual hieroglyph of him writing on one of the walls in Egypt, and laying down the writing. We didn't need writing until a certain point. When the consciousness got to a certain level, then we had to use writing. Before that, we had 100% absolute total holographic memory. There was no reason to do it. Anything that any person ever experienced, anybody else could re-experience at any time that they wanted to. And we still have people like that on the earth right now, today. There's whole groups of them. One of them is the Aboriginals in Australia. Those people are all linked together in a very specific level of consciousness. And they can, if one of them were here in this room right now, then in essence I would be giving it to all of them. They can go into what they call dream time and come in, and it's a holographic world. They would be able to walk around in here and look at this happening. They could experience the whole 5 days, as many as they wanted to. And but it would not be real. It would be like a hologram. It would be like light. It would not be real. It would be, they couldn't remove things or use things, but it would be like hologram. But it's a perfect memory. They could smell, they could hear the sounds. It'd be just like being here, but it wouldn't be real. So we obviously didn't need writing when you got that kind of memory. It was only when we jumped up to the next level of consciousness, which is where we are now, which is a stepping stone from one unity consciousness, which is the first one, to the next unity consciousness, which we call Christ consciousness. Now, both of those also have unity consciousness, only Christ consciousness is memory. Memory is the key to all of this. The memory of the Christ consciousness body is much greater. If the Aboriginal could come into this room, and they would be remembering it, but from like a light field. If the Christ conscious being remembered the room, they would literally be here in time and space. It's a little different. They would just appear. They'd be here. If they remembered an orange, if an Aboriginal remembers an orange, then he's got an orange, but he can't do anything with it. If a Christ conscious being remembers an orange, he's got a real orange. He can pick it up and peel it. So obviously, whatever his memory extends through all time and space and everything that's ever occurred. So all things are possible. It's a whole other level, and there's levels beyond that. Our memory, we are in a separate state. This is the stepping stone. We contain within us the parameters of Christ consciousness, which I'll geometrically be able to show you at the right moment. But we are not Christ consciousness, and but we're a stepping stone in that someone from the first level of consciousness steps into this level of consciousness and then gets out of it as quick as possible to the third one. Have to pass through here, but you don't want to hang out here. because we are not a harmonic consciousness, and we will destroy any place that we are in, i.e., look at the Earth. Just give us enough time, and we would completely kill this planet. And it's just the way we are, because we are not harmonic. And I have to explain a lot to explain what that means before I can get to that place. And writing is the key. That's how you take someone from the first level of consciousness and get them out into the second level. You introduce writing where they no longer access memory directly from within themselves, but they have to go through a symbol or a word or a color or a form or a shape, which is how our memory is. We have to access something. We can't even remember something unless we check. Our eyes have to move at very specific angles, even to remember things, which is connected to shape and form. And we don't have that ability. And as soon as you do that, then that is part of. There's something else that changes, which is the breathing pattern itself. And we result in this separate state that we see now, where we see ourselves in a body, and everything out there feels to be separate from us. And we think that we could have thoughts and feelings, and that somehow it doesn't affect anything out there, which is illusion. It isn't true at all. Because our thoughts and our feelings dramatically affect what's out there. But anyway, a lot of these things I'm just lightly touching on. I'm going to go over later in detail. So writing was the key in all of this. This was his wife, Shizak, who was also one of my teachers. She was the one that brought me here in the first place, about 3,500 years ago. And she's also a recording from the feminine view rather than the male.